So as I said from my last video, I've been taking a look at how to create an effect of kind of a smoke or particles moving along the floor of maybe a scene to be like fog or some type of effect like that. And so first of all, you notice my background, instead of just the grid, I made just a basic floor tile, nothing fancy. Threw it together in Blender as a background because it's important to see some contrast to see how it would look in a real scene. So in doing that, I wanted the effect to kind of come up and swirl back and forth along the floor into some path. And so in order to do that, I really needed to follow some kind of curve. And Unity gives us a Bezier curve, and it's a little bit more complicated to use, so I just wanted to just go over creating and using a Bezier curve in your VFX effects graph and some of the things we can do with that. And whether I'm going to use a particle, and whether you use a particle or have it follow a ribbon trail following it, I'm not sure, but I know that I'm going to need to use a Bezier curve. So I'm going to go over kind of the details of exactly how to do that and build it piece by piece, since I haven't used that before in any of my videos. So I always like to go over in a bit more detail the first time I use anything, instead of going through it, because it can get quick. In the videos I've watched, they can go through it pretty quick, and in 20 seconds they've already got it all set up, and it can be a little tricky to follow. So let's start with making a VFX graph. So let's create our VFX graph. Why are you not making it? All right. There we go. And let's call it Bezier curve sample. Oops, forgot the R. It's named after a Frenchman, Bezier, because he was the one who came up with it. It's really just a quadratic equation. You plug in an x value, you get a y value that will trace a curve. So I'm going to open this up, drag it over here, right there. Just give it a little bit more room. Put it into my scene, and we see, of course, our default particles coming out. Make that a little bit smaller. All right. So we've got our default particles, and what we have is being initialized just by our standard defaults are given a velocity. So what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of the velocity. We are going to change, we're going to get rid of this lifetime random. Well, really what we want is, instead of that random, what we're going to do is we are going to shut that off, which just is one lifetime. It's not going to vary. Each particle is going to have the same lifetime. And let's make it 4. What we're going to do is, you'll notice it has no velocity, so it's not moving. It's just sitting in that same spot. So instead of giving it a velocity, what we're going to do is we are going to set the position using a Bezier curve. And so what we want is, over the lifetime of the particle, I want it to trace a curve on the screen. So I'm going to create a sample Bezier curve. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the position of my particle based on the output of my curve. And a Bezier curve takes 4 components. It takes a start, it takes 2 control points, and it takes an end. And the manual for Unity actually does a pretty good job. I mean, it defines and shows you kind of how the Bezier curve works, and we'll see how it works once we get it hooked up. But what we need is we need inputs for these, and what we need them to be is positions on our scene. And so what we can do is we can bind a object on our scene to these values. So what I have here is, just to speed things up a little bit, what I did is I created 3 or 4 vector 3 properties to expose, to feed into our Bezier, because the Bezier needs a vector 3 input. And then what I did is I created 4 objects on my scene, and I put them under the Bezier curve sample just for simplicity's sake. And what I did is I went up here, and if you click up on this icon, you can see you can assign them to icons. And as long as you have your icon showing, go over here, as long as your 3D icons are showing and are large enough, you'll see them on your scene, which is a handy way of seeing what they are and seeing which one of these items they are. In fact, I didn't do this last one, so I'll do that. That's all it takes. And what I did is I moved them, so our Bezier curve is going to start here. Their control points are going to control how the curve goes, and we can see once we get all of the items going. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bind these to my elements on my VXF graph. And if I select this, come over here, make this a little bit bigger, there's a lot going on here. If I add a component, and if I add a VXF, if you just start typing PRO, you'll see VFX property binder. And what this allows me to do is bind a element's position, and I want the transform position of my object. And what you do here is the property is the name of your property in your VFX. So in this case, it's going to be POS start. And I happen to name these the exact same. I like names that match, that go together, but this is the property name in your properties. And this one is going to be the actual element that it's going to bind to. And the easy thing to do is to click and drag it. You can pop up the whole list of elements, but there's a lot of them. Clicking and dragging is far easier. So I'm just going to go and I'm going to do this 3 times. Type in the name, POS1. Click and drag our POS1 over. POS2. And POS end. So now those are all bound together. And now what's going to happen is if I drag these guys down, I wonder if I can select more than one. Nope. Be nice if I could do those all at once. Then what we're going to want to do is hook these up to the inputs of our sample Bezier curve. And now for time, what it needs to do is it needs to go between 0 and 1. And so what we want is the age of our lifetime. So over the lifetime of our particle, we want it to travel from the start to the end. So if we create a node, time, age over lifetime, of course, goes from 0 to 1. And if we feed that in, we can start to see some items moving from our start to an end. Now I'm looking from the top down, and I really want these to be rotated flat. Right now they're standing on end. And so what I want to do is I want to add an angle, or do a set angle. And I want to set that angle's X to be 90 degrees. And if you watch my other videos on controlling our particles, you'll know that we can rotate around that X axis, which of course is the red line on our particle there. So that's handy. All right. So now we have those facing up and they're going along our Bezier curve. And if we select one of these, we can see as we move these, it will change. The control point changes the curves of our Bezier curve. And if they're both on the same side, it can actually make a single arc if you don't want it to go back and forth. And the control point is over there. But what I want to do now is I want to stretch it. I want to be able to stretch it in the direction that the particle is moving. And right now the particle's Y is up and X is left and right. And if I go in and I add a scale, and I scale, say, the X by 2, you'll notice it just gets fatter, and it's not really stretching in the direction it's moving, which is not what I want. What I want to do is I want to rotate it so it's in the direction that it is moving. And if I had a velocity, I could do this, right? I could go into my velocity and I could use the velocity is the direction that it's moving, and I could calculate an angle, but I don't have the velocity. But what I do have is the tangent. And you'll notice the tangent is going to be the direction that it's moving along the curve. That's what a tangent is in a curve. And so I can use the tangent in order to move in that direction. So if this is a curve and the tangent is the direction it's moving, what I want is I want this angle. And so what this angle is, in order to calculate it, the tangent of this angle is going to be opposite over adjacent. That's what tangent does in our trig function. Therefore, if I take the arctangent of our z direction, which is this direction, over the x direction, I will get the angle in order to rotate to make it face that proper direction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create some nodes in order to do that. So what I do is I have some nodes already made, and just to speed things up, I am going to copy these nodes. I'm going to paste them in here. I'm going to move this over a bit, give us some room. Then what I'm going to do, back these together a little bit better, is I'm going to feed. What I want to do is put the Z on the top, put the X on the bottom. Then what I'm doing, so you can see I'm dividing the Z over the X. I'm taking the arctangent of it. The output of this is in radians, but the angle is in degrees, so I need to convert the radians to degrees. So I multiply it by degrees. I divide by radians. Of course, 180 degrees is pi, or 3.14 radians. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to want to update actually, I don't want to set the angle here. I want to actually set the angle here. I'm going to get rid of this guy. All right. And I'm going to want to rotate around the Z axis. So remember, the Z axis is coming up at us. And so now what you can see is that the X is going kind of fast, but the X direction is pointing in the direction that we're moving. So now, if I go in here, and I set the scale of my X, we can see it now stretches in the direction that it's moving, which is exactly what I wanted to do. So remember, being familiar with those trig functions is very helpful, and trying to figure out how to get the actual values is also very useful. So what we want to do now is I want to actually extend this and make a second Bezier curve on top of or after this other Bezier curve. And the reason I want to do that is that I want a more complex curve than just this simple one that moves back and forth. I want it to move back and forth even more. And so I want to add a second Bezier curve. Now there's a lot of items here, and I'll show another thing that Unity gives us, which if I go into here, I can convert it to this subgraph operator. So if you have a combination of nodes that you use a lot, or if you want to simplify one of your VFX graphs, you can group a group of nodes together and make it into a subgraph, and then just add it as one node. And so this is very handy, and in this case I want two of these, and it's going to get kind of complicated, so I'm going to create that into a subgraph operator, and I'm just going to give it a name. And what it's done is it has broken this down, and now I just have this one item that represents that group of both my Bezier curve and my output of my position and my output of my angle. What I'm going to do is, I've done this before, so I am going to just show quickly what that looks like. You'll notice that this just says parameters. So if I want to go in and I want to actually edit this, I can go into, see, it just stuck it down here. So if I double click on that guy, let's open him up. Oops, it's this guy. Open him up. What we can see is here's our group of items. Here's our position, output. And here's our parameter. It just called a parameter. So we're going to rename this to angle, because that's going to be the angle that we want to output. We'll save him. Close him down. And now we see that output parameter got changed to angle. It's going to be a little bit more easy to see. Then we're going to hook this guy back up. Our position right there. Our angle right there. So now we're back in business. So it simplified our graph a little bit. So what we're going to want to do now is we're going to want 2 of these, but we need to make some changes. First of all, this age over lifetime, I now want it in half of its age. I want it to travel the full distance of my curve. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, instead of taking the age, I'm going to multiply this. I'm going to multiply it by 2. So now when the age is 0.5, this is going to be 1. So now you can see they're traveling twice as fast. And they just kind of continue on past it once they finish moving past that last point. So now what we need to do is we need to do a couple things. We want to add a second group of these, and then once we have that second group, we are going to want to feed the position from our first Bezier curve into our position if it's in the first half of its lifetime, and feed it the second Bezier curve if it's the second half of its lifetime. Now there's a bunch of nodes to do that, so I'm just going to kind of fast forward here, add all those nodes and skip forward just so you don't have to watch me creating all those and take all that time. Okay, so I made all those changes, so I'll go over those. And like I said, there's a number of nodes that I had to make, and it's a lot of repetitive stuff that we did up to this point, so I didn't want to repeat all that. But what I did is I created 3 more objects on my scene here. Position 1, position 2, and position end of my second Bezier. The start of my second Bezier is going to be the same as the end of my first, so I don't need to make another start. Then what I did, so we can see we used our subgraph operator here, and I duplicated it. So this was the one we made before. And remember, we had multiplied our item by 2 so that the first half goes to the first Bezier. So the second Bezier, I want to add 0.5, and then I want to multiply it by 2. And I want to add 0.5 because I want it to start when this is 0.5, I want this to be 0. So did I say add? Subtract. So when this is 0.5, when the time's 0.5, I want this to be 0. And then I want to multiply that by 2. So when this goes from 0.5 to 1, this output is going to go from 0 to 1. Because remember, the input of our Bezier curve goes from 0 to 1. That's what I need for this time input. And so I've linked it to my end is my start. And then I have my position 1, position 2, and position end. And then what I need to do is I want to feed in the output of our first Bezier for the first half of my lifetime, the second Bezier for the second half of my lifetime. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to feed my lifetime into 2 compares, and I'm going to compare it to 0.5. So if it's less than 0.5, or actually if it's greater than 0.5, it is going to feed in this top one. So this is true if it's greater than 0.5. And if this bottom one is greater than 0.5, then it will be feeding in the angle from our top one. And if it's less than 0.5, it'll be taking the bottom position and angle. So it's basically what this is doing. And then it's feeding the output of those branches into our position and our angle. So I had to set up these property bindings. Again, it's just a lot of repetitive stuff. You can see that I now have exposed our other positions here. I've bound those to our other points on our scene. Now let's shrink those down so we can see our items bigger. And now we can see that we're moving first through our first bezier and then through our second bezier. Now, one thing to note is that when it goes from the first one to the second one, you want them to kind of, the angles to be fairly smooth, because if it's too disjointed, it's actually better that way. But if I move this too far over here, you see it kind of takes a sharp angle change, which doesn't look good. So you're going to want to set up your Bezier curves to have this start of this curve kind of match the angle to the end of that other curve. So you can see now we have a nice combination. And if you wanted to, you could even make a third one if you want an even more complicated curve, but we have a lot more options here. Why is that not being selected? There we go. A lot more options here to change around. Keep selecting that wrong item. Make our curves anything you want, really. So you can play around with those. And so now we really have a full control for the path of our smoke as it moves across of our floor. As you can see, there's a fair amount to this, so I wanted to cover this specifically. I ran into more trouble as I went along, so this is kind of stitched together, but I think we got where we wanted to be. Kind of showed all the details of how to make our Bezier curves, how to have our path go along. So now what I'm going to be doing is I will work on adding some smoke particles to this and trying to decide whether, do I want particles to go along? Is it going to look better to have a trail and to have those segments form my path? And really, I won't decide until I play around with it a little bit. But after I do that, I will post my results of that, and hopefully we'll have the end result of that will be a nice smoke effect of trails of smoke moving along a floor. So stay tuned for that. Hopefully I'll get to that this week and be posting that in a week or two. So stay tuned and keep watching the channel, and hit that subscribe if you like this video and you find it useful and helpful. Subscribe and keep watching for that follow-up video on our smoke effect.